They said the cook poisoned the children, but no one in Black Hollow could explain why the water still tasted clean as the rope tightened under the morning sun. And that was the first lie Jack Callahan noticed before he even stepped off the boardwalk. Standing half in shadow outside the saloon doors with dust clinging to his boots and a silence in his chest that had once belonged to a different man. A man who used to believe towns didn't burn their own people alive over rumors until he learned. They do it quietly, with votes, whispers, and fear, and that was why he stayed on the edge of things now, watching instead of speaking, until he saw her, Liang Wei, small-framed, hands shaking, clutching a leather satchel like it was the only thing keeping her alive, while men twice her size shouted accusations that didn't match the way she kept looking at the ground instead of the crowd, as if she already knew the truth didn't matter here. Only volume did, and Jack noticed something else. Something no one else cared to see. The satchel wasn't empty. It was heavy, too heavy for just a cook's tools, and when it shifted slightly as she stumbled, he caught a glimpse of folded paper, ink stains, and dried herbs. The kind of mix you didn't carry unless you were either very dangerous or very desperate. And before he could decide which one she was, the sheriff raised a hand like it was already settled, like the town had already agreed she was guilty. But Jack saw the hesitation in the sheriff's eyes, that thin crack of doubt people get when they know they are wrong but don't have the courage to stop anyway. And then Liang spoke, her voice barely carrying over the wind, saying she didn't poison anyone. She only cooked what she was taught, what her grandmother taught her before everything was taken. And for a moment, just a moment, the crowd went quiet enough that Jack could hear the wind moving through the wooden sign above the saloon. And that's when he decided silence was no longer an option, because he had seen enough men die behind certainty dressed as justice, and enough truth buried under fear to know that if he walked away now, he would be just like them. So he stepped forward, slow, deliberate, boots pressing into the dirt like every step had weight, and the crowd turned toward him the way they always do when something refuses to behave. And someone called him out, saying he had no business here, but Jack didn't answer. He just looked at Liang, then at the satchel, then at the crowd, and said nothing yet, because sometimes the first thing you say in a town like Black Hollow decides whether you leave it alive or not. And as the sheriff's hand drifted closer to his holster without quite touching it, Jack finally spoke, calm and steady, saying only this: if you're going to judge her, you better be ready to explain why your own children are getting sick faster than your accusations can spread. And that was the moment everything stopped being about a cook and started becoming something the town would not understand until morning. Jack did not move when the crowd shifted its weight toward him, because men like him learned a long time ago that the moment you step forward in a town built on fear, you either become part of its story or its warning, and he had no intention of becoming either unless it was necessary. While behind him, Liang Wei stood still with her satchel pressed close to her chest like it was the only solid thing left in a world that had already decided she did not belong in it. And the sheriff, Brody Hayes, finally spoke again, his voice lower now, less certain, asking Jack what exactly he meant by sickness spreading faster than accusations. But Jack did not answer immediately, instead letting his eyes move across the street where a man coughed into his sleeve, where a woman kept her child at arm's length like she was afraid even proximity could pass something unseen, and that silence was louder than any explanation he could give, because truth in Black Hollow was never declared, it was observed. And what people observed was that over the last 3 days, the town had started to change in ways no one wanted to admit, and Liang Wei, despite being the one they blamed, had been seen near those same families before they fell ill, not harming them, but helping them, leaving behind small cups of bitter tea and folded cloths soaked in herbal scent that lingered longer than comfort allowed. And that detail, that inconvenient detail, was what made Jack stop treating this like a simple misunderstanding, because he had lived long enough to know that fear always finds a target, but it rarely finds the right one. And now the crowd was no longer shouting as loudly as before, not because they believed him, but because doubt had started doing its work in silence. And Liang finally spoke again, her voice fragile but steady, saying she could help them, that she knew what the sickness was, that her grandmother had treated it in a village near the river years ago, before they burned the records, before they called it superstition instead of knowledge. And the word superstition made something shift in Jack's expression, because he had heard that word used too many times as a weapon against people who simply knew things others did not understand. And the sheriff stepped closer now, lowering his hand from his holster, not because he trusted her, but because he feared what would happen if she was telling the truth, and they ignored it. And from the edge of the street a boy ran forward, coughing hard enough to bend him in half, collapsing near his mother's legs. And that single moment broke the rhythm of the crowd completely. No more shouting, no more accusations, only the sound of uncertainty settling like dust after a storm. And Liang moved without hesitation, not toward the mob, but toward the boy, stopping only when Jack gave a slight nod, not permission, but acknowledgement, and she knelt beside the child, opening her satchel carefully, revealing dried herbs, folded notes, and a small worn book bound in dark leather that seemed older than anything else she carried. And as she began to prepare something simple, something patient, the crowd watched in a silence so tight it felt like it might snap. And Jack realized this was the moment everything would turn, not because of force, not because of law, but because one child breathing easier would matter more than 100 accusations. And yet, even as the boy's breathing began to steady, Jack's eyes drifted toward the ridge above town where a thin line of riders had appeared without sound, watching, waiting, as if they already knew this moment was only the beginning of what Black Hollow would have to answer for by morning. The moment the boy's breathing began to steady on the wooden sidewalk, the entire town of Black Hollow seemed to forget how to speak, because silence has a way of revealing what noise is trying to hide. And Jack Callahan stood a few steps back, watching Liang Wei with the kind of focus that comes only when a man realizes he has already crossed a line he cannot uncross. While the sheriff Brody Hayes stared at the child as if seeing a problem he no longer understood how to solve, and somewhere behind them the crowd no longer looked angry, only uncertain, as if the ground beneath their certainty had quietly shifted without permission. And Liang did not look at any of them while she worked, her attention fixed entirely on the boy, her hands steady in a way that did not match the trembling fear she had carried just moments before. And as she adjusted the simple mixture she had prepared from her satchel, Jack noticed something else, something subtle but impossible to ignore. She was not guessing. She was remembering, like someone repeating steps learned long before fear ever had a chance to erase them. And when the boy finally took a deeper breath and leaned into his mother's arms, a sound of relief moved through the street that no one needed to explain, but no one yet dared to claim as understanding. And that was when Jack saw the riders more clearly on the ridge, 5 of them now, motionless against the morning light, not descending, not intervening, only watching. And he knew men like that did not appear without reason, because in places like this, observation was always the first step before consequence. And the sheriff finally broke the silence by asking Liang where she learned to do what she just did, and for the first time she hesitated, her eyes lowering toward the satchel as if the answer weighed more than the question itself. And when she spoke, her voice carried something quieter than before, saying her grandmother had been a healer in a mountain village where illness was treated with patience and knowledge instead of fear and punishment, until the village was accused of spreading disease and everything they built was dismissed as dangerous. And Jack noticed how carefully she chose her words, not as defense, but as someone who had learned that truth is often punished before it is heard. And the sheriff listened without interrupting, not because he believed her, but because he was beginning to understand that disbelief no longer protected him from what was happening in his own town. And then a second cough echoed from further down the street, followed by another, and another, not violent, not sudden, but familiar enough now to make the crowd shift uneasily, because patterns are harder to ignore than accusations. And Jack stepped closer to Liang again, lowering his voice just enough for her to hear, asking her if what she treated in that child could help others, and she nodded once, but warned that it was not quick, not simple, and required trust from people who had spent too long believing fear was safer than understanding. And at that moment the sheriff looked at the people around him, then at the riders still waiting on the ridge, then at the boy breathing more evenly in his mother's arms, and something in his expression changed, not conviction, but calculation, the kind a man makes when he realizes the town is already moving beyond his control. And Jack noticed it too, because power does not always collapse loudly. Sometimes it simply stops, making sense. And as Liang opened her satchel wider, revealing more folded notes and carefully preserved herbs, Jack understood that what had begun as a rescue in an alley behind fear was becoming something far larger, something the town had no name for yet. And above them, the riders finally turned their horses slightly, as if responding to a signal only they could see. And in that quiet shift, Jack realized the morning had already begun to decide what Black Hollow would become, even if no one standing there was ready to admit it. The riders on the ridge did not move closer, but their presence alone was enough to press down on Black Hollow like an unseen weight, and Jack Callahan felt it the same way. He once felt storms coming before the first drop of rain, quiet, distant, but unavoidable, while below them in the street Liang Wei continued working with steady hands, moving from person to person as the sick were brought forward, not in panic anymore, but in cautious silence, because fear had shifted shape in the last hour and was no longer loud, only uncertain, and uncertainty is what makes a town dangerous in a different way, because people no longer follow the loudest voice, they start looking for the first answer that feels stable, and Jack saw that happening now in the Sheriff Brody Hayes, who no longer stood like a man ready to enforce order, but like a man trying to understand whether order still belonged to him. And when Liang finally stepped back for a moment, letting her hands rest on the edge of her satchel, Jack noticed how carefully the townspeople were watching her now, not as a threat, but as something they could not categorize, and that shift was more powerful than any weapon, because once a crowd stops knowing what something is, it stops knowing what to do with it. And that was when the first woman from the crowd stepped forward carrying a cloth bundle, asking quietly if what Liang had done for the boy could be done for her husband who had been sick for days, and no one stopped her, not the sheriff, not the mob that had gathered earlier, not even Jack, because something in the air had already changed direction, and Liang nodded slowly, not with confidence, but with responsibility, and began again, explaining in simple terms that what she was doing was not immediate, not absolute, but careful, built on patience and observation. And Jack realized that every word she spoke was rebuilding something the town had spent years tearing down. And as more people approached, one by one, carrying questions instead of accusations, the street transformed without announcement into something closer to a waiting line than a confrontation, and the sheriff finally lowered his voice enough to ask Jack what he thought was happening. And Jack answered honestly that he thought the town was remembering something it had forgotten, that not every stranger arriving in Black Hollow came to take something, and not every unfamiliar practice was a threat. And above them the riders on the ridge shifted again, one of them raising a hand slightly, as if signaling to the others, and Jack followed their line of sight down to Liang's satchel, now partially open on a wooden crate, revealing not only herbs but carefully preserved notes written in a language most in town could not read. And yet, even without understanding the words, they understood the result, because people were still standing, still breathing, still asking for help instead of demanding punishment. And that alone was rewriting the rules faster than any meeting or decree could ever manage. And Jack stepped slightly closer to Liang again, not to protect her this time, but to observe her like he finally understood she was not running from the town. She was quietly changing the way it defined survival. And when she briefly looked up at him, there was no triumph in her expression, only exhaustion and focus, as if she knew that moments like this never lasted long without resistance. And as the sun climbed higher over Black Hollow, the silence in the street grew heavier, not with fear this time, but with anticipation, because everyone present could feel it, even if no one could yet name it, that whatever had started here was no longer just about one cook, one cowboy, or one accusation, but about whether the town would continue believing only in what it feared, or finally allow itself to believe in something it did not yet understand. By the time the sun had climbed high enough to stretch shadows across the wooden street of Black Hollow, the silence that had settled over the town was no longer empty, but full of something heavier, something that pressed against every window and every doorway like an unspoken question. And Jack Callahan stood near the edge of the gathering crowd, watching how quickly uncertainty had replaced anger, because fear can burn hot and fast, but doubt lingers like smoke long after the fire is gone. And Liang Wei moved quietly among the people without urgency, only purpose, her satchel now resting on an old crate beside her as she prepared what few supplies she had. left with steady movements that seemed almost too calm for the weight of attention surrounding her, while Sheriff Brody Hayes remained near the center of the street, no longer issuing commands, only observing, as if trying to decide whether the town still followed him or whether something else had already taken its place. And above them on the ridge the riders remained motionless, their silhouettes unchanged against the pale sky. And that stillness was beginning to feel less like observation, and more like anticipation, as if they were waiting for Black Hollow to make a decision it did not yet realize it was being asked to make. And Jack noticed how the people closest to Liang were no longer stepping back, but leaning in slightly, watching her hands, watching the way she explained each step in careful, simple terms, not as someone claiming authority, but as someone offering understanding. And when another man brought forward a woman struggling with the same illness the boy had shown earlier, Liang did not hesitate, only nodded and began again, her voice steady but quieter now, as if conserving energy for what she knew would not be a short moment in the town's memory. And Jack found himself thinking that what was unfolding here was not transformation in the dramatic sense people expected, but something far more fragile, the slow replacement of assumption with observation. And he could see how easily it could break if pressured too quickly, because towns like Black Hollow did not change through persuasion alone. They changed when enough people saw something undeniable at the same time. And that moment seemed to arrive when the second patient began to show signs of relief, subtle but real, enough for the surrounding crowd to shift again, this time not toward skepticism, but toward cautious hope. And the sheriff finally stepped forward, not to interrupt, but to ask Liang directly what she would need if others were to be helped. And the question itself carried more weight than anything he had said earlier, because it was no longer about accusation or defense, but about continuation. And Liang paused for the first time, looking down at her satchel, as if measuring what remained inside against what the town was now asking of her. And when she answered, she did so without certainty, but with honesty, saying she needed time, cooperation, and most of all trust from people who had never been asked to offer it before. And that word trust rippled through the crowd in a way that was almost visible, because trust in Black Hollow had always been something earned through violence or authority, never through patience. And Jack glanced again toward the ridge where the riders still waited, and he realized that their stillness was no longer neutral. It was watching for escalation, for resistance, for collapse. And in that realization, he understood the true tension of the moment was not between Liang and the town, but between what the town believed it was and what it might become if it allowed this fragile shift to continue. And as more people began to step forward carrying questions instead of accusations, the street filled not with noise, but with hesitant movement, like a town learning a language it had forgotten how to speak. And Jack Callahan stood at the edge of it all, knowing that whatever came next would no longer be decided by fear alone, but by whether Black Hollow could survive the first real possibility that it had been wrong for a very long time. The first sign that Black Hollow was no longer standing still came not from the crowd, not from the sheriff, and not even from Jack Callahan, but from the quiet way people began to act, as if tomorrow mattered again. And that shift was so subtle it almost went unnoticed, like the moment a storm changes direction without changing the sky. And Jack saw it in the way a store owner stepped out with a bucket of clean water instead of closing his shutters, in the way a mother no longer pulled her child back from the street, but instead watched Liang Wei demonstrate how to prepare a mild herbal mixture, and in the way Sheriff Brody Hayes stopped asking who was responsible and started asking how many could be helped. But change in a place like this never arrives without resistance, and that resistance appeared first in silence from the ridge, where the riders who had been watching all morning finally broke their stillness, one of them shifting in the saddle, another turning slightly, as if communicating without words. And Jack felt that familiar tightening in his chest that came when a situation stopped being local and started becoming larger than anyone on the ground could control. And Liang noticed it too, though she did not look up, only continued working, her hands steady but her breathing slower now, as if she understood that attention itself was becoming a pressure she had to endure rather than escape. And the sheriff finally stepped closer to Jack, speaking in a low voice that carried the weight of responsibility rather than authority, asking what Jack thought those riders wanted. And Jack answered honestly that they were not waiting for violence. They were waiting for a conclusion, because groups like that did not gather for curiosity. They gathered for resolution. And in Black Hollow resolution usually meant someone would be forced to stand on one side of a line that had not yet been drawn. And as if responding to that thought, the riders on the ridge began to descend slowly, not rushing, not threatening, but deliberate, and the entire street below them seemed to tighten in response, conversations fading, movements slowing, until even the sound of boots on wooden planks felt amplified, and Liang finally lifted her head for the first time in a long while, her eyes meeting Jack's briefly as if confirming she had expected this moment to arrive. And when she spoke, her voice was calm but measured, saying that what she was doing here would never be accepted quickly because people do not easily trust what they do not understand. And Jack realized she was not speaking about the sickness anymore, but about something deeper, something about knowledge itself and how it survives in places that refuse to recognize it. And as the riders reached the base of the hill, the sheriff raised his hand not to stop them, but to signal for space, because even he understood that this was no longer a moment for enforcement, but for witnessing, and the crowd parted without instruction, forming a wide, uneasy circle around Liang, Jack, and the slowly arriving figures. And when the lead rider finally stopped at the edge of the street, he did not speak immediately, only observed the scene with an expression that revealed nothing but calculation, and Jack could feel the entire town holding its breath, waiting for words that would decide whether the fragile shift they had experienced was real or temporary. And in that suspended silence, Liang placed the final prepared mixture into the hands of the waiting woman from earlier, instructing her gently on what to do next. While the riders continued to watch without interruption, and Jack understood in that moment that the real test had not been whether Liang could help the sick, but whether two worlds that had spent their entire existence misunderstanding each other could remain in the same place long enough for truth to matter more than fear. And as the lead rider finally stepped forward into the street, the entire town of Black Hollow braced itself for a decision that would define what kind of place it was going to become, whether it would return to what it was before or step into something it had never been willing to believe possible. The moment the lead rider stepped down from his horse, the entire street of Black Hollow seemed to narrow into something smaller and more fragile, as if the town itself was holding its breath to avoid breaking. And Jack Callahan immediately understood that this man was not here as a threat in the way people usually imagined, but as something far more complicated, someone carrying authority that did not need to be shouted to be felt. While Sheriff Brody Hayes straightened slightly beside him, not in challenge, but in recognition of pressure he could not ignore, and Liang Wei remained still near the center of the street, her hands resting lightly on the edge of her satchel, her eyes observing rather than reacting, as if she had already seen versions of this moment before in other places. And the rider spoke at last, his voice calm and deliberate, saying that he had come not to accuse and not to interfere, but to understand what was happening in a town that had begun sending signals beyond its borders. And those words alone shifted the atmosphere again, because they were not the language of fear or rumor, but of observation and consequence. And Jack noticed how the sheriff reacted to that distinction immediately, realizing that this was no longer just a local matter. And Liang finally stepped forward one pace, not in submission but in acknowledgement, and explained in simple terms that what she was doing was not invention but preservation, that the knowledge she carried was not new to the world, only unfamiliar to this place. And as she spoke, the rider's gaze shifted briefly toward the sick boy who now stood supported by his mother, breathing more steadily than before, and something in his expression softened, not into agreement, but into recognition that results have a language of their own that does not require translation. And the crowd, still surrounding them, no longer felt like a mob or even an audience, but like witnesses trapped between disbelief and observation, unsure which direction history was leaning. And Jack found himself noticing small changes in posture around him, shoulders lowering, hands unclenching, eyes no longer fixed on accusation but on outcome. And the sheriff finally asked the rider what he intended to do, and the rider answered that he intended to report what he had seen accurately, without interpretation, because accuracy was the only thing that prevented entire regions from repeating their own misunderstandings. And that statement carried more weight than any judgment could have, because it implied that Black Hollow would no longer be isolated in its assumptions. And Liang, hearing this, did something unexpected. She did not plead or defend herself. but instead began to organize her remaining supplies more deliberately, as if preparing not for escape or confrontation, but for continuation. And Jack realized in that moment that she had never been trying to survive the town. She had been trying to stabilize it long enough for it to recognize its own condition. And as the rider turned slightly to observe the gathered people once more, he asked a simple question about how many others in the town were affected, and that question alone changed the direction of every thought in the street. Because it transformed the situation from an isolated incident into a shared responsibility, and one by one, people began to look at each other instead of at Liang, as if realizing they had been asking the wrong question from the beginning, and the sheriff exhaled slowly, finally lowering his posture into something closer to understanding than enforcement. And Jack felt the tension that had defined the morning begin to shift into something less immediate, but more permanent, like the beginning of a decision that would take time to fully understand. And Liang, without looking up, continued speaking in a calm voice about what could be done next, about steps and care and patience, and the rider listened without interruption. And for the first time since all of this began, Black Hollow stood in a silence that was not built on fear or accusation, but on the unfamiliar possibility that truth might require cooperation rather than control. And as the light moved slowly across the street, Jack understood that what had arrived with these riders was not an end, but a turning point the town would not be able to step away from, no matter what it chose next. As the sun began to tilt lower over Black Hollow, stretching long shadows across the wooden street and softening the harsh edges of the morning tension, the town no longer felt like it was standing at a breaking point, but instead like it had already crossed into something unfamiliar and irreversible. And Jack Callahan noticed it first in the way people no longer clustered in fear or accusation, but instead in hesitant groups, listening more than speaking, while Sheriff Brody Hayes stood slightly apart now, no longer trying to hold the center of control, but instead watching as if control itself had become something shared rather than owned. And Liang Wei remained near the middle of it all, her movements slower now, not from exhaustion alone, but from the quiet weight of being observed as something more than a suspect or outsider. While the lead rider and his companions had dismounted fully and now stood among the townspeople without forming distance, their presence no longer feeling like judgment, but like documentation, as if they were simply recording what the town chose to become in real time. And the lead rider finally spoke again, saying that what he had witnessed here would not be interpreted through rumor or fear, but through direct report, and that what mattered most was not what people believed had happened, but what could be verified through outcome and consistency. And those words settled into the crowd differently than anything spoken before, because they removed emotion from the center of authority and replaced it with observation. And Jack realized that for a place like Black Hollow, that shift alone was enough to change everything. And Liang, hearing this, began to organize her remaining materials with a calm precision that suggested she understood something the others were only beginning to approach, that stability in a place like this would not come from approval, but from repetition, from proving again and again that what had worked once could work again. And as she did this, people began to approach her not in groups, but individually, each one bringing questions rather than accusations. And the sheriff, after a long pause, finally asked what would be required for the town to continue addressing the illness spreading through its families. And Liang answered without hesitation that it required patience, access, and a willingness to accept that knowledge did not belong to any one group, but to anyone willing to preserve it responsibly. And Jack saw something shift in the sheriff's expression at that moment, not surrender, but recalibration, as if he was adjusting to a version of leadership that no longer depended on fear. And above them the riders prepared to leave, mounting their horses slowly without urgency. And the lead rider looked once more across the street, not at any one person, but at the town as a whole, as if confirming that what he had come to witness had reached a point of clarity worth carrying forward. And when he finally turned his horse toward the ridge, the silence that followed was not empty, but full of unfinished understanding. And Jack remained where he was for a moment longer, realizing that nothing in Black Hollow had been permanently resolved, but something far more important had been initiated, a break in the pattern of assumption that had defined the town for years. And as Liang continued speaking quietly with those who remained, guiding them through steps that were simple but unfamiliar, Jack understood that the real change was not in any single moment of relief or recognition, but in the fact that people were now willing to ask what they had never asked before. And as the light faded slightly and the street settled into a calmer rhythm, Black Hollow no longer felt like a town reacting to a crisis, but like one standing at the edge of learning how to live differently, even if it did not yet know what that fully meant. As the last light of the day stretched across Black Hollow, and the town finally settled into a silence that no longer felt like fear, but something closer to reflection, Jack Callahan stood at the edge of the wooden street watching what had once been tension dissolve into slow, uncertain movement, and people were no longer gathered in clusters of accusation or defense, but instead moving between homes, between neighbors, between conversations that no longer began with blame but with questions. While Liang Wei remained near the center of it all, no longer surrounded by suspicion but by cautious presence, as individuals approached her not as a threat, but as a source of uncertain hope, and Sheriff Brody Hayes stood a few steps behind her now, not as an enforcer, but as a witness to a shift he could not reverse, and the lead rider and his group had already disappeared over the ridge, leaving behind only the impression of their observation, as if Black Hollow had been briefly measured against something larger than itself and allowed to continue under review. And Jack felt that weight in a way he could not easily explain, because the town had not been saved in a dramatic moment, but instead had been slowly redefined through attention. And Liang continued speaking softly to those who remained close, explaining again and again that what she offered was not certainty, but process, not instant cure, but careful understanding. And people listened differently now, not with expectation of miracle, but with willingness to participate. And Jack noticed how even the sheriff began to change his language, no longer speaking in terms of guilt or innocence, but in terms of coordination and responsibility. And as evening approached, the streets slowly emptied into something resembling order rather than chaos, and Liang finally paused, looking down at her hands as if realizing the weight of everything she had carried through the day was no longer just survival, but consequence. And Jack stepped beside her quietly, not asking questions, only acknowledging what had taken place. And she spoke to him without turning her head, saying that towns did not change because people were convinced all at once. They changed because enough people decided to continue asking different questions tomorrow than they had asked yesterday. And that idea lingered in the air between them as the last groups of townspeople drifted away. And the sheriff finally approached once more, not with authority but with agreement that arrangements would need to be made for continued care, supplies, and structure. And Liang nodded, not in triumph, but in acceptance of responsibility that extended beyond any single moment. And Jack realized then that what had unfolded in Black Hollow was not an ending, but a beginning that would not announce itself loudly, because real change rarely does. And as night began to settle over the town, the lamps along the street were lit one by one, not as signals of fear or defense, but as signs of continuity. And Jack looked out toward the ridge one final time where the riders had been, now empty against the darkening sky, and understood that their departure did not close the story, but confirmed it was now in the hands of those who chose to remain. And Black Hollow, for the first time in its memory, did not feel like a place waiting to be judged, but a place learning how to decide what kind of future it would allow itself to build.